In the last video, I beat chapters 1 to 3 on Black Myth Wukong. You guys seem to really enjoy that video, so here is the final part. If you like the video, consider liking and subscribing. These videos are a lot of work to make and it really helps out the channel a lot. Now with all that being said, let's jump straight into the video. I begin chapter 4 in front of the village. I run a little bit, eventually making it to the village of Langshi. I proceed into the village confronting my first new enemy, a spider-like creature. This creature moves fast and does some heavy poison damage with each hit. After defeating this enemy, I find a chest, but it ends up being trapped and spawns a bunch of little spiders I need to fight. They prove not to be that difficult and are defeated swiftly. The chest ends up containing nothing special, so I move on. I eventually make it to a door that just before I can open, Baji stops me. He proceeds to turn me into a giant pig for some reason. I later find out the reason is because we are talking to the second sister. Too bad she sees through the disguises and she becomes my first boss fight. The fight begins and I'm instantly charged at and jumped on. This proves to do some devastating damage, but nothing I can't handle. With a ton of damage done to the boss by my red tides transformation and my proficiency with the immobilize skill, the boss stands no chance, and ultimately falls. She runs away with Baji in hot pursuit. I really wish this stupid warthog would wait for me, but whatever. I eventually come face to face with a giant hole. I decide to go down it and end up in a giant spider's web. I guess you could say I'm in a bit of a sticky situation. Hey? Hey? Fine, don't laugh. That's fine. Oh wait, that's a fucking spider coming for me. Fuck. I proceed to wake up in the webbed hollow. I open up a chest and continue on my way. Now, I won't talk too much about the underground spider tunnel system just because it is mainly a lot of running, but I'll still be covering the bosses I fought. I'm sorry if that enrages a lot of you. After a while of traveling, I walk through this cobwebbed wall. I notice a giant worm looking creature nearby and decide it's a great idea to go over and hit the giant worm. Turns out this worm would be a mini-boss named the Elden Armor Worm. I begin my attacks with a heavy hit to stun the worm. This proved to be quite effective. This worm turned out not to be that difficult and I ended up not even breaking a sweat whilst defeating it. Now I had defeated the worm, I moved on, eventually noticing this weird glowing shrine. This random woman shows up and tells me to leave it alone. But last I checked, I ain't no simp and I ripped the purple tag off the shrine. I would need to rip off a few more of these tags to unlock the secret boss fight in this chapter. I would later run into my next boss fight, the Centipede Guai. I started off this fight strong, managing to tear through its health. I didn't have many issues with this boss until it called in its buddies to gangbang me. I was overwhelmed and I died. I went straight back into this fight, this time dodging his gangbang attack and defeating the Centipede Guai with ease. After the fight, I'd continue on, eventually running into another shrine and ripping its tag off. After traveling for a while longer, I would eventually see what looked to be a limp hand with a mirror in it. I'd approach the hand to realize it was still alive. This fearsome creature would be known as the Buddha's right hand. Really creative name, I know. I would begin fighting the Buddha's right hand. Between the hands swinging from side to side, it was difficult to hit combos on the hand. Thankfully, I was eventually able to deal enough damage to see the hideous creature that was connected to the right hand. And I can assure you that that thing isn't a Buddha. It proceeded to do an attack where it poisoned the floor. Instead of doing the smart thing and using my pole stance, I would instead stand in the poison and take damage. Thankfully, I was able to defeat the creature before I succumbed to the poison. It would try to escape but be ripped out of the air by the same woman I met earlier. Turns out she's a spider. I wonder why she'd help me. I eventually caught up to Baji, but instead of fighting, he was walking slowly next to the second sister, as if he had been hypnotized or something. There were also two other girls there. From what I could hear, they talked about their mother and some kind of wedding. Who would want to marry Baji? I'd walk my way down to the front of the building they entered, and here I would now face my next boss, Zhu Baji himself. I started the fight off swinging, doing loads of damage and using immobilize to get as many hits in as I could. This fight with Baji turned out to be really easy, and before I knew it, the fight was over. Baji proceeded to run away, but before I hunted him down, I did a bit more exploring and eventually ran into a frog. This frog turned out to be a poisonous frog, and ended up doing a lot of poison damage, but I wouldn't be outdone by a frog. I continued to attack, doing a fair amount of damage myself, and just as I thought the battle was won, the frog did a combo attack that wiped my health, killing me. So close, yet so far. Like usual, I went straight back into the fight again, with the knowledge of what to expect. I was ready this time. I went in doing loads of damage with my transformation and stunning it with my Wandering White, eventually doing enough damage to defeat this oversized frog. After defeating the frog, I decided it was now time to hunt down that stupid warthog Baji. I would enter the fight with Baji, assuming it was going to be an easy fight like the first time. Turns out I was wrong. Apparently, in the time it took me to defeat the frog, Baji learned how to hit like a truck. Thankfully, with a little bit of skill, I was able to push Baji into his second phase, his primal form. This form would be hard, but nowhere near as hard as when he would turn into a mudfish and start doing mass amounts of damage to me. With his constant shapeshifting and his unpredictable moves, in the end, I was defeated. It took me a few attempts, but eventually I got a good run. This time, I pushed him through his first phase with ease and was ready for his boar state. I managed to do a lot of damage, and I even managed to stagger him a few times. This would prove to be so important to defeating him. And in the end, I finally managed to beat Zubaji. Defeating him returned him to his normal state, but before he could catch up, he was abducted. What is up with this man and disappearing? Seriously? I proceeded to try and find Baji yet again, working my way up the hill and fighting every enemy in my path. Eventually, I found Baji hanging around with some old lady. What can I say? Man likes them cougars, I guess. This old lady would turn out to be the next boss, the Violet Spider, and she was ferocious. From her ability to slow me from her web attacks and the poison damage she could inflict, it was going to be a tough battle. I started off strong, doing decent damage and barely needing to use any of my gourd. The Violet Spider's agility made it hard to hit her, but thankfully I was able to whittle her health away, and I would ultimately be able to stun lock her for a while, and would finally beat the Violet Spider. Once defeated, the Violet Spider ran away, leaving me behind, and all of a sudden millions of baby spiders ran at me. I instantly ran, leaving Baji behind. I'm sure you'll be fine. I worked my way up the path until I was saved by one of the Spider Sisters. Weird, but I'll take it. I decided to continue following the path that was now in front of me, wiping out any enemies in my way and looting all chests I could. Until eventually noticed this group of warriors training. They got easily wiped out, but turns out the person training them was a beast known as the Beetle Commander. Thankfully, he wasn't that difficult and he ended up falling just like his students. I would eventually make it to what looked like a clearing. Here I would see the Vile Spider and her children talking to an oversized version of Papa Smurf. This oversized Smurf was known as the 100-Eyed Taoist Master, and he'd be the final boss of Chapter 4. I thought I was ready to fight him, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. I started off strong, learning his attacks. However, I wasn't ready for the massive amount of damage he would inflict, especially with his Thunderbolt attacks. It would appear that this boss was in a league of his own, and I wasn't anywhere near it. I continued on, however, until it finally beat me. But I wasn't done. I went straight back in, this time making it to his second phase. Here's where I truly realized I wasn't ready for this boss. The entire arena flashed yellow, and he started to control lightning, and before I could do anything, the boss ended me with one combo. I obviously needed to be better prepared. I was informed by my stream that I had missed the secret needle in this chapter, and if I could acquire it, I would certainly win. But before I went to go get the needle, I decided to go back and fight the bosses I had missed, so I went back and faced the final dragon, known as Yellow Long. This dragon proved to be the toughest one yet. From his affinity towards lightning, just like the dragon before him, and his quick attacks and combos, I found it very difficult to defeat him. I easily spent 1 hour fighting this boss over and over again, getting better with each and every attempt until finally I was able to defeat him with some tricks told to me by chat. Next, I'd go and pull off another one of those talismans, and then I'd head back into the caves and fight the Venom Taoist. He'd proved to be nothing special, just another oversized bug that needed to be squashed. Eventually, he was defeated and ran away. I wasn't going to let him get away, so I continued to hunt him down. I would eventually find him and proceed to fight him yet again. This time, however, it'd be a 2-stage fight. His first stage was nothing special, it was pretty much the same fight as the first time I challenged him. And that felt the same for the second phase as well. Maybe he did more damage, but not really enough that I noticed it. In the end, the Venom Taoist fell and his defeat formed a painting on the wall. This painting would lead me to the secret part of the map, where I'd be able to fight more bosses and obtain the needle I was after. I'm going to do a quick summary of my time in the Purple Cloud Mountains, just because this chapter has already gone on for ages. I entered the mountains, eventually running into some creepy guy with a mask. He wanted me to go and retrieve an item from some enemies nearby. Once I had retrieved the item, I returned back to him and gave it to him. Turns out, he is evil and wanted to fight. Thankfully, he wasn't tough and was super easy to defeat. Next, I'd be guided by my chat over to this giant scorpion looking boss. Apparently, he didn't care if I took from his chest, but breaking his vases? That was too far. I had a few attempts at this boss, but after failing at him so many times, I eventually decided to leave and return later. I went back to the dragon I had fought in chapter 3, and gave him some sort of orb. He seemed to not care, but in return, he'd give me a map to a land where all the vendors would be chilling. I went to the land and challenged the blacksmith, known as the Yin Tiger. If I'd be able to defeat him, I would unlock another curio slot and would unlock him as a transformation. It was a very tough battle. between his speed and my immobilize being basically useless, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to beat him. But somehow, I managed to beat the Tiger on my first attempt. Now with that done, I returned to the Scorpion boss, and after a few more attempts, I was finally able to defeat him, unlocking me some great armor that I would never end up using. I would now continue up the mountain and encounter my next challenger, the Dusk Veil. This would be another 2-stage fight. For the first stage, all I did was stay near his feet and would evade his stomp or swing attacks. This managed to work quite well. After defeating his first phase, day would roll into night and the sun would become a blood moon. I put up a solid fight against the second phase, but in the end, I ran out of mana and heals and ended up dying. Thankfully, I managed to go straight back in and get him into his second phase just as easily as I did the first time. This time, however, I saved most of my mana and heals, allowing me to damage the boss a lot easier. It also helped that I now knew the boss's attack patterns and how to dodge them. In the end, the Dusk Veil stood no chance and was defeated on my second attempt. For defeating the Dusk Veil, I would receive the needle from a Stake Woman, and I was now ready to face the final boss yet again. The way the Weaver's Needle works is the moment you use it, the needle hones onto an enemy and would attack it relentlessly. This needle had the ability to be able to knock the final boss right out of his second stage. So, with the needle in my possession and my newfound confidence, I challenged the 100-Eye Dallas Master again. I instantly hit him with a heavy attack and managed to get him half health quite easily due to my previous experience fighting the boss. I had learned how to dodge some of his hardest attacks, making his first phase a walk in the park. Once the animation was done for the boss entering his second phase, I instantly activated the Weaver's Needle. This instantly knocked him out of his second phase and basically took all of his health. Now that he was back in his original form, I used my transformation spell and managed to easily defeat the final boss of Chapter 4. For beating the boss, I received Wukong's 4th relic and the cinematic played, signaling the end of Chapter 4. Rosy cheeks, grey hair. I now start Chapter 5, Golden Child, Crimson Blood. I start off in the Woods of Ember, surrounded by enemies. Thankfully, none are hard to deal with, and I begin moving through the lands and opening a giant door. Here I would run into my first boss within 5 minutes of starting this chapter. This boss's name was Pale Axe Stalwart. This Minotaur was strong, using his giant axe to land solid blows. And not to mention the fact that from who the fuck knows where, someone was launching giant fiery rocks at me. After damaging the boss to about 1/3 of his health, I needed to get away because of the rocks. And when I went back over to him, I could speak with him. Turns out he's actually friendly and asked if I could assist him. He told me about the iron carts that were launching those rocks at me and asked if I would destroy them. I agreed. I instantly started working my way up the steep pathways on the mountain. Here I would encounter my first iron cart. To be honest, I thought these things would be easy to destroy, but each one acts as its own mini boss fight, with them having their own unique attacks that deal massive damage. I was quite shocked, to be honest. Thankfully, I was able to defeat the first iron cart by getting behind it and hitting it in the back. Now that the first iron cart was defeated, I carried on, fighting some unique enemies along the way. I quickly found out that after defeating a certain enemy, it would build up pressure and explode, doing an AoE attack that did a ton of damage. I would need to be very cautious about this enemy. After a bit more searching, I ran to my next boss fight, the Father of Stones. He proved to be super weak and really wasn't much of a threat. With a few good immobilized spells and some solid heavy attacks, I was able to defeat the Father of Stones with ease. I'd later worked my way through a cave, defeating more enemies and collecting a chief's soul along the way. Eventually, I found a clearing that led me to my next cart, but I felt a lot like I was in a kill box. Within the walls surrounding me and the boss right in my face, I had no choice but to hope that I could dodge all of his attacks effectively. I ran straight at the boss, trying to deal as much damage as I possibly could. I used mostly combo moves, trying to keep the cart stunned so it wouldn't be able to land any blows. Thankfully, this proved to be a very successful strategy, and I was able to defeat the cart quickly. I later ran into a fox dangling from a tree. It was begging for my help, asking me to get it down. It kinda felt a bit like a trap, but I approached anyways. Turns out I should listen to my gut more, because it was a trap. Two giant heads came out of nowhere, ready to fight. These heads went by the names Fast as Wind and Quick as Fire. This would be my first duo boss fight of Chapter 5, but definitely wouldn't be my last. I primarily focused Quick as Fire due to it being on the ground and an easy target. Thankfully, Quick as Fire would go down fast, leaving only Fast as Wind. But even with his ability to fly, a few perfectly timed stuns proved to be all I needed to get enough damage to defeat him. After defeating those two, Baji and I spoke with the fox a bit more. Turns out she was the daughter of the Bull King, and her brother had gone insane seeking power and decided to take over the lands. She said she could help us, so we swallowed our pride and decided to trust the fox. I followed her until she made it to a cliffside into the volcano. I was told to jump, and being the trusting monkey I am, I decided to say fuck it all and jump down. Where I'd land would be known as Furnace Valley, quite the accurate name if I do say so myself. I moved my way through Furnace Valley, facing some new enemies that acted a lot like reskinned versions of the skeleton porcupines from chapter 2, until I was guided to a boss by my chat. But this boss's arena was unique. It was located on lava, so to be able to fight this boss, I equipped the fireproof mantle that I acquired in chapter 1. This would allow me to walk on lava without taking damage. The boss I'd face would be known as the Flint Chief. It was a pretty simple fight. I think the tough part of this fight was meant to be the fact that it was located on lava, but with that being irrelevant to me, he proved to be a super simple boss fight. The next bosses I'd face would be Misty Cloud and Cloudy Mist. This would be another duo boss fight with them taking turns tagging in and out of the battlefield. One seemed to possess the ability to shoot charged laser shots I would need to dodge, and the other one carried around a giant log. Yep, a log. I don't know why, but sure, fuck it. With them tagging in and out of the fight, both were taking a fairly equal amount of damage, with Misty Cloud being taken out first and Cloudy Mist being taken out second. I continued moving my way through the mountains, finding enemies and finding this cool little skip that allowed me to dodge a bunch of fighting. I would eventually make it to this beautiful looking structure that was made into the paths of the mountains. Here would lie my next battle. I'd be introduced to the Bull King's wife and her old lover, but it was all a ploy, and the Bull King's wife actually was a furry little piece of shit, that's right. It was Baji in disguise. Well, the lover didn't find it as amusing as I did, and decided to challenge me. The lover's name was the Keeper of Flaming Mountains. He proceeded to put me in what looked like a blank canvas arena, and he'd use ink to make creatures to defend himself and attack with. Thankfully, none of these attacks proved to be very effective. I'd immobilize the boss and deal damage and deal with any of his ink creatures whenever they would join the fight. It actually ended up being quite easy until he brought in a creature known as a yin yang fish. It ate Baji. What the fuck? Oh well. I started to attack the fish, trying to get my ugly little companion back. Thankfully, with my previous experience fighting Baji and his fish form, I was quite well versed in the attacks that the creature would use, and ultimately, I was able to defeat the yin yang fish and the Keeper of Flaming Mountains. I would then run into my next cart fight, but just like the others before, I was able to easily defeat the cart because it used the exact same attacks as the first two. I continued on and grabbed resources as I went, until I ran into this weird mushroom boss. He did massive poison damage and managed to kill me quite a few times. Thankfully, I was able to defeat him, after quite a few attempts. He proved to be more difficult than most of the bosses I had fought up until this point. Now that I had managed to pass the mushroom, I now ran into a giant annoying ball that would kill me instantly if it hit me. This proved to be quite frustrating, but made for some very funny moments where I'd use the ball to absolutely destroy some enemies. Once past the ball, I continued up the hill, eventually making it to the final boss fight. Turns out, the daughter of the Bull King was a chick with a dick. Wait, no, it's the Bull King's son, never mind. Turns out, the Bull King's son wanted Wukong's relic, but the Bull King refused, so here I would stand, myself versus Red Boy. This battle proved to be quite easy, even with the attacks being unique and their own style, they still reminded me of some of the attacks from earlier chapter bosses, and were easy to counter and dodge. But that isn't to say that Red Boy didn't hit like a tank. However, I was able to defeat him with no gourd left, but with still a mostly full health bar. The Bull King proceeded to try and give me Wukong's relic, but turns out I didn't put that creature out of its misery, and Red Boy launched over and stole the relic. After stealing the relic, he proceeded to eat it? What the fuck is wrong with these people, seriously? Whatever, he transformed into a way more dangerous and deadly state now. Here is where I'd spend the next 30 minutes running into the fight, getting some decent damage on the boss and then mistiming one singular attack between his ability to get spikes to stab out of the ground and make his elbows massive blades that had very weird dodge timing. I struggled, however I didn't give up. I couldn't, I had come so far and I wasn't backing down now. I pushed on, hit after hit, dodge after dodge, until finally I was able to defeat the Yaksha King, formerly known as Red Boy. For defeating him, I was granted Wukong's 5th relic, and the cinematic played. This would be the end of Chapter 5, Golden Child, Crimson Blood. I would now begin Chapter 6, Unfinished. I'd start this chapter off at the bottom of Wukong's mountain. Here I would need to fight wave after wave of Celestial Court enemies. Turns out they really didn't want me to go and see Wukong. Well, too bad for them. I was determined. I fought my way through them all. until I finally made it to my first boss fight with the Supreme Inspector. He'd taken me a few attempts. Between him spending tons of time in the sky and only coming down to hit me with heavy strikes, I struggled. I eventually made it to his second phase, where I would be surrounded by a giant ring of fire, and the Inspector riding a fiery wheel around the place. This provided to be quite an annoying attack, but thankfully I was able to take him down. After taking down the Inspector, he tried flying away, but I wasn't going to let that happen. I dragged him back down towards the ground and thought I was going to die, but I was saved by Wukong's somersault cloud. I was then introduced to where I was, Mount Hugo. The somersault cloud that saved me earlier would be my way of transportation around the mountain. I need to use it to find the bosses located in the area and defeat them to acquire Wukong's armor. The first boss was located over near a giant thunderstorm area with some red trees surrounding it. The boss was the cloud treading deer. Some of its attacks were the ability to summon in tornadoes that would chase me around, an attack where it would fly into the sky and slam down on me, and a few lightning attacks. However, the boss itself had very predictable attack patterns, which made it easy to defeat the boss first try. However, this was a two-phase boss fight. He shedded his outer layer and turned into a blood deer. Too bad this meant nothing. I used my abilities and my transformation to be able to do more than enough damage to take down the boss, and receive Wukong's boots, in return, the Lotus Silk Cloud Treaders. My next boss would be located over an area that looked a lot like a massive battle had taken place. It went over and the boss tried to sneak attack me. Thankfully, Baji was able to stop the boss, known as the Golden Armor Rhino. This fight I need to take quite slowly and wait for the Rhino to charge attack me, because if I didn't, I could be left in a very vulnerable position, allowing the Rhino to deal massive damage. However, this proved to be quite easy. I'd stand back and wait for the Rhino to attack, either stunning it and doing damage, or waiting for it to slam attack and damaging it. The boss wasn't much of a tank, I made do massive amounts of damage to the boss, and in the end it helped me defeat it. In return for defeating the Rhino, I received Wukong's chestplate, the Soju armor. My next boss would be the giant grasshopper jumping around the map. I need to land on it with the somersault cloud and grab onto its antenna and try to rip them out. I was having a lot of trouble with this part, falling quite a few times. I decided to take a break and fight another boss that was nearby, the Son of Stones. This boss was a tank. He seemed to have a massive damage resistance and a strong affinity for lightning. This allowed him to not only take minimal damage, but deal massive amounts of damage in return. I needed to play this carefully and dodge his attacks, otherwise I would stand no chance. Thankfully, with all the experience I had gained, I was able to dodge most of his attacks and slowly remove his health, finally defeating him. I then decided to return back to the giant grasshopper. With failed attempt after failed attempt, I was getting frustrated until finally I managed to do it, and I was able to attempt to pull out the grasshopper's antenna. I took my first attempt, but they didn't come out. I healed up and went right back in, this time ripping them out. Ripping these antennae out of the grasshopper's head gifted me with Wukong's helmet, the Golden Fang tail crown. I was now only missing one piece of Wukong's armor, his gauntlets. Thankfully, I'd get these in my next fight. Baji was fighting a little mantis for some reason, until it decided it was sick of this shit and jumped inside of him, and started attacking Baji from the inside. Baji would proceed to turn me into a bug so I could fly inside of him and fight the mantis. Here in Baji's stomach is where I would fight the Emerald Armed Mantis. This boss was difficult. His first phase wasn't that bad, with mainly just a lot of swiping attacks. I did die a few times on the first phase, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. But the second phase, the fucking second phase, I still have nightmares. He'd dip his fucking claws into Baji's stomach acid and blood and would enter his second phase. Not only did he feel like he was faster and more unpredictable, it felt like he did way more damage. With each passing death, my patience for this boss got thinner and thinner. Thankfully, before I could run out of patience, I got a good run, making it through the first phase with minimal damage and going into the second phase with lots of mana and health. This was essential for me to beat the Emerald Mantis, and I was finally able to defeat him. I would receive my final piece of armor, Wukong's gauntlets, from defeating the Mantis, and it was now time for me to go and claim Wukong's staff. Went over to the water curtain cave and entered, eventually making it to Wukong's staff. Extended high into the sky, Baji hopped on what looked like a throne and spoke a tale, and eventually told me to try and take the staff. I placed my hand on it, and as I pulled, the entire land shook. I finally managed to pull the staff off the ground, and I now commanded Wukong's weapon, Jingu Bang. I was now faced with two options, either go and fight the secret boss for the best ending, or go and face Wukong. I decided to go for the good ending. Turns out I missed a task I needed to be able to fight the secret boss. So I went and used my Ring of Fire on a merchant from chapter 3, went and fought and defeated a boss that allowed me to finally go and face the secret boss. I turned to the painted room from chapter 3 and approached the monk boy from chapter 3. He had opened up the wall onto a snowy mountain. Here is where I had faced the secret boss. I climbed the mountain, hitting a shrine along the way. I'd now come face to face with the boss Erlang, the guy from the beginning of the game, the one that sealed Wukong away originally. It was time for me to face him. Erlang had some very strong abilities, from being able to make his axe huge and attack me with it to teleporting around and shooting energy beams at me. This battle was difficult. Eventually, however, my chat told me of a build where I'd be able to build up my chi and for the most part be able to stun lock Erlang. So I put the build on and began trying. The idea behind this setup was putting on armor that would increase chi recovery and me to use my upper miner bat and my plantain fan over and over again, pretty much trapping him in a stun lock. It took me a few attempts and the fight was very difficult to get used to. Thankfully, however, I was finally able to defeat Erlang, but he was not done yet. He turned into his bird form and tried to escape, but I pursued him. But we ended up reenacting the beginning of the game with me being slammed into a mountain. But we would now both turn into our primal forms. Here, I would now need to face the 4 gods from the intro tutorial. Each boss was very tanky or requiring a lot of damage to defeat them, but one after another, they all fell. I wasn't going to let anyone survive my rampage. Now it's time for Erlang. I went in, dealing little bits of damage at a time. It turns out Erlang was just as much tanky as all of the previous bosses. Now due to the fact I don't have my gourd, I was curious how I'd heal after taking damage. Turns out every single time I used a charged attack, as long as it landed, I'd regenerate my health. This proved to be vital to me surviving and defeating Erlang. His powers were strong, and he was a tough foe. But even with all of that, he never stood a chance, and I managed to beat him with a punch to the face. It was now time for me to go and see Wukong. I worked my way up the mountain and fought waves of enemies at a time, but none were that difficult. I truly felt like I was ready for whatever I was about to face. I eventually made it to the top, there sat the rock that Wukong had been sealed in. I interacted with the rock and entered. Here I would meet an old monkey and he'd take us on a boat ride, telling myself and Baji stories of Wukong. It seemed that this old monkey really knew Wukong well. Eventually, we'd make it to where the final battle would take place. Baji insisted on trying to help me, but the old man told Baji that only I was permitted to go in and challenge Wukong's shell. So I got off the boat and in front of me sat the stone monkey. He started the fight, launching at me, trying to deal massive damage off the start, but I was quick enough to evade. Originally, I assumed that this fight was going to be a close range combat fight, but it turns out that I would be wrong. After finally defeating the stone monkey's first phase, he'd then start using the elements of fire and ice, from freezing the water and shattering it to do an AoE attack, to launching rings of fire out from himself for another AoE attack. Nowhere on the battlefield was safe. But it didn't matter. In the end, I was able to beat him. Turns out, however, the stone monkey would not be the final boss. In fact, what was inside the stone monkey was much, much worse. This terrifying boss would be known as the Great Sage's Broken Shell. This would be a 2-phase fight. The first phase not being that difficult for my first attempt. Went straight in trying to stun the boss, but it didn't seem to work that well. Not only was he great at dodging heavy attacks, he also was able to use my own attacks against me. Thankfully, with a bit of determination, I was able to make it through to the second phase. Before the second phase began, an absolutely stunning animation would play. Truly gorgeous, and I highly recommend playing through the game just to see it. At the end of the animation, the Great Sage took all of Wukong's relics from me, so I no longer had any of my buffs from them. I hadn't given up hope yet though. I kept pushing, trying to deal damage to the Great Sage, but due to the fact that I used up all my mana and was out of heals, I sadly failed. I was so close to defeating him, but still so far away from it. But victory was in sight. Went straight back in, used my heavy attacks only in the first phase. It turned out to be the best approach for minimal damage and minimal mana usage. I did fail my second attempt, but did the same thing on the third attempt. Would eventually break into his second phase again, and get into a good rhythm of what attacks the Great Sage would use and how to dodge them. And I even managed to be able to use my plantain fan to get some good staggers, so I could continue to do damage. And in the end, that proved to be enough. I beat the Great Sage on my third attempt. I received all the relics back and fell to my knees in the water. Wukong was finally free from the Celestial Court. Because I had defeated Erlang, the secret ending played. Now I'm not going to show it here, but I highly recommend beating the game to see it yourself. And that would mark the end of Black Myth Wukong. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and subscribe. This video did take quite a lot of time to make, and I just wanted to give another shout out to everyone that watched me live. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope I'll see you all in the next video. Bye for now.